It is indeed my first book of fiction in English, or in fact, my first book of fiction, period, and yet it's hardly my first book, either in English or in Russian. To answer this question, one should probably think about what it means to be a bilingual writer, practically, theoretically. I think at this point, I'm not the kind of bilingual writer that writes equally and simultaneously in both languages. I think there is a kind of imperfect distribution. And let me just tell you how it all came about. Like I said, I've been writing fiction or creative nonfiction for quite a while. I wrote my first story that I'm not really ashamed of in Russian, which is my native language, back in Moscow, I think when I was 18, sometime in 1986, I believe. When I came to this country, I was already actively writing poetry and making kind of my first steps as a writer of fiction. The transition, however, to writing creative prose, shall we say broadly, in English took longer than, I guess, I had anticipated, which is not to say that I hadn't tried. In fact, very soon after coming to this country, I was an undergrad at Brown, where I transferred from Moscow University, and I was studying creative writing, and I was very fortunate to be in a fiction writing seminar with John Hawkes, the late Jack Hawkes, a very, very fine and original American postmodernist writer who considered himself to some degree a disciple of Nabokov. And it's in the seminar that Hawkes taught in the spring of 1988, so I'd only been in this country for 6 months, that I began to write, or tried to my hand at writing in English, but it didn't really work. And what I ended up doing initially was write short stories in Russian and translate them into English. And then eventually what happened is a kind of natural process when I was already in graduate school brought me to writing scholarly work in English. And that transition was not slow or painful. However, I really didn't write my first short story in English that would later be published until the spring of 1995, when I defended my doctoral dissertation at Yale University. So as you can see, it was a very slow transition. And really, in that sense, I think there is a complementary distribution, imperfect complementary distribution. I think the less I wrote prose in Russian, the more I was doing so in English. And at this point, I only write in Russian very occasionally if asked by a publication in Russia, if specifically commissioned. My everyday language of work is English, and particularly in prose. With poetry, I really have composed very little original poetry in English, although I have done a lot of literary translation. So basically, this is all to say that this collection was in the making for a long time in some respects, but in other respects, only over the past, I think, in fact, I know exactly that it all gelled, it all came together when we were expecting the birth of our first daughter. So 5 years ago, I began to think of a collection of stories in English, and Waiting for America was already on its way to publication. And when Waiting for America, my literary memoir, came out, I really felt that it was time to release these stories into the world, into the mainstream. But just to say one thing, there are 8 stories here. 5 of them I wrote directly in English, and they have no, complex archaeology. But 3 had at one point been composed in Russian, and then as I started thinking, and were published in Russian, I started thinking of how to English them. I realized that a faithful literary translation wouldn't do, and I rewrote them. And in one case in the story, The Afterlove, which is not called The Afterlove in the original, I added about 10 pages, a whole middle section, which does not exist in the Russian. And so they're not really auto-translations. And in that sense, again, it's not a perfectly balanced bilingualism. There's a factor of self-compensation, which I think is always present in the lives of writers who write in languages that are not their first literary language. In addition to what I just told you, of course, the daily practice of being someone who is bilingual and being someone who is a literary person, and coupled as these things are with my profession, that of a a teacher of literature and Jewish studies and Russian culture, makes one very dependent on the proximity of a good library. And BC's very excellent Russian collection has really helped me in the sense that you sometimes run to the library to check on a metaphor, on a reference. You're sometimes haunted, and I think this is very common for bilingual writers, by this experience. What if what I think I created actually I didn't create? It's some sort of a vestige of the Russian past that's sort of sprouting, that's making its way through the other language, through English. And I can tell you, on one occasion I discovered that I had inadvertently borrowed from one of my favorite post-war Soviet writers, Yuri Trifonov, which I really came to realize, and I checked against his original, and of course I had to leave that. These things happen sometimes, and having a good library is very useful for that sort of thing. But I think I'm not a bicultural person. I think in that sense I'm a tricultural person, perhaps even more polyvalent for that matter, because there is the Russian background and the Soviet background, of course, the Jewish background, and then the background and the daily reality of Anglo-American culture and living. And of course, all of this is negotiated by a creative writer who is an immigrant, who in his family life speaks Russian to his young children and English to his wife. And this is all tremendously fascinating to theorize about, but to answer precisely how it is that I, function, what my identity is composed of, what its architecture is all about, I'm not entirely sure, except to tell you that there is no question that Jewish questions, Jewish concerns, Jewish themes form some sort of core of my existence. It's not the same as to say that my worldview is Jewish-centric. No, I think there's a difference, but it is to say that I often apply Jewish lenses, Jewish optics, when I examine the world. And in this collection of stories, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, where every single story has Jewish characters and Jewish concerns of various sorts, I think the authorial sensibility probably, although it's hard for me to look at this from a distance, from without, the authorial sensibility probably strikes the reader who is not familiar with me personally as Jewish, or as predominantly Jewish, or as riddled with Jewish questions, as sort of, pierced with Jewish bullets, however you want to put this, however you want to belabor this notion. At the same time, I realized after the collection was already in the stage of page proofs, as I was proofreading it, that a lot in it has to do with my Soviet past and the 20 formative years that I spent in the Soviet Union as a member of the Jewish minority. Whether this is a matter of settling scores with the past, of unburdening oneself historically, religiously, or ethnically, or whether it's just a fictional exploration of one's historic, non-fictional past, but the lives of the protagonists in Yom Kippur, many of whom are Jewish Russian immigrants from the former Soviet Union, are lives of people to whom that Soviet experience is not merely a footnote, but rather something that is quite palpable and quite significant, and not necessarily something that they can dismiss in some sort of broad, stroke of the pen. Truly speaking, I've only had one mentor, in the sense that a mentor is someone who mentors you, who works with you, who is a regular presence in your literary life, and whom you're comfortable turning to with the hardest questions, but also from whom you're prepared to hear a verdict, the verdict. And I've always been fortunate to have such a mentor in my family, because my father is a writer, David Shrayer Petrov. I have translated some of his work into English, and we've worked together on other projects. But I obviously grew up, in his family, and his presence always meant several things. One, on a purely technical level, he instructed me in the art of writing Russian poetry when I was quite young, and then I happily forgot all this. In fact, I never had this period that a lot of young poets in Russia go through when they write poetry as teenagers. I think I learned Russian versification at about 8 from my father, and then for another 10 years I really didn't touch poetry as a composer. So in that sense, he was my teacher. He was also my aesthetic teacher, in the sense that we constantly discussed writing. He also, and this continued until we became refuseniks and he was expelled from the Union of Soviet Writers, he exposed me to a lot of living writers. Growing up, I went with him probably on a weekly basis to the Central House of Writers in Moscow and met many literary lights, lesser writers, practicing writers, literary practitioners of various sorts, which was very important. In other words, it's sort of both, I think it deflated this Russian romantic myth of a writer as a prophet, but also, in other words, because I experienced these people as they were drinking, playing pool, as they were gossiping. But I also think it was a kind of first-hand encounter with living literature. But that stopped in about 1979-80. After that, I only saw a very small group of my father's literary friends on a regular basis. When I started composing poetry seriously, and then prose already as a young adult, my father would usually be my first reader. And I can tell you honestly, to this day, I fear his judgment the most, because I think he's a very fair judge, and I think he always has my best interests in mind. So that's a way of answering your question, and I, of course, like and admire his own writing very much. I've had sort of periods of time when I would be in regular communication with a writer whose work I was interested in. In Russia, during the last, more or less the last year of my life in Moscow, I became quite close to Genrikh Sapgir, a very, very fine poet who was probably the patriarch of Soviet underground avant-garde, and who gave me some very, very helpful advice in the fall of 1986. And then in America, I already mentioned John Hawkes, with whom I studied fiction for a semester. Although I don't think I quite lived up to his expectations, Hawkes sort of had this vision for me that I would become that I would compose short stories, sort of sexually perverse short stories set in the Russian countryside. He felt that there was a niche that had not been occupied in Anglo-American letters. And at the time, this was 1987, 88, imagine I was a recent refusenik. I was seething with political questions. I wanted to write fiction about, political changes in the Soviet Union, and I disappointed him. But nonetheless, the experience of having him as a teacher, and also his looking over my prose and correcting it, was very useful. And then I want to name one other person, Albert Cook, who was my teacher of literary translation at Brown, who was a professor of comparative literature, a multilingual person who actually learned Russian at a very late age, was brilliant, and was a literalist. He believed basically that you take a poem and translate everything word for word, which is of course, a theoretical and practical impossibility, but Cook helped me, I think, shape my relationship with both my Russian literary roots and sort of my ambitions as an emerging practitioner of Anglo-American letters. But other than that, it's kind of a cocky thing to say, but I've kind of stuck to my own guns in as much as possible when it comes to writing. You know, to each writer his own, you know, path, and I think in that sense, mine has not been studied with mentors, I guess. Yeah, so the question is this collection some sort of a deliberate statement on the lives and destinies of immigrants from the Soviet Union, from the predominantly Jewish diaspora, which is quite extensive, say 750,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union living in North America, another million in Israel. It's a substantial community. And of course, our voice, our lives are only beginning to enter the cultural mainstream in North America, only over the past less than, you know, 6-7 years. I think because of that, anything you do as a fictionist about Russian Jews gets perceived as some sort of collective statement, and there's a danger to that. I never thought, when I was writing these stories, that they represent more than the lives of their individual characters and perhaps the vision of their author, of their creator. But at the same time, I have to sort of, in final reckoning, I have to tell you that probably what is true is that it's some sort of a inconclusive, it offers some inconclusive evidence towards seeing how in the lives of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, three principal components vie for domination, and these components do not necessarily live in a harmonious everyday coexistence. This Russianness, cultural Russianness and Sovietness, this Jewishness, which is historical, ethnic, and religious, and this Americanness of, or Canadianness to some extent, of the daily lives of these people. These three sort of strands, these bands, these components of their identities compete. And this interests me very much. And of course, when the lives of these characters, of my characters, are also riddled with universal passions and obsessions, and with specifically Jewish concerns, assimilation, acculturation in a marriage, this makes for, I think, this creates a kind of raw material from which, you know, I enjoyed conjuring up these fictions, these stories. I'm not sure, again, that I view myself as some sort of voice of my generation, but at the same time, empirically, when I read these stories, what I see is very often the response is visceral. People view them as representing more than just the individual fictional destinies of the characters, but representing them. For instance, the story Sonishka in this collection, which is one of my favorite stories in the book, which has to do with an encounter of two former lovers who were lovers as young people in Moscow, who ended up living very disparate lives and are reunited in a suburban Connecticut apartment of the female protagonist, Sonishka, and basically tell each other the stories, their lives over the past 10 years, their lives in America as immigrants. This story, I think, resonates with some sort of collective, I suppose, truth, collective verity about our generation. Namely, that beneath the veneer of success, because most people, I would say, of my generation of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, professionals, tend to have done well in their new lives. But beneath the veneer of success, there is some sort of sadness. There's alienation and loneliness, which is why I think this encounter in the story is colored in such happy tones, because what they share is a amorous friendship set against a background of Soviet life, which was oppressive and politically unhappy. But precisely to compensate for that, I think they loved with a sort of intensity that they haven't experienced after coming to America. So in that sense, I think there is something to it. Whether it's a uniquely Jewish Russian-American experience or one of an immigrant's alienation, I'm not sure. But I do think that coming from the Soviet Union as a Jew to America and as a young person and trying to make it here and then reflecting on one's past makes for a fascinating sort of mixture of nostalgia and sort of desperation that is often necessary to write, strong fiction. It's a great question. Whether there is a leitmotif or a central sort of message to the whole collection. There's a reason two stories frame the collection. Zalman's disappearance is the opening story, and the title story, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, closes the collection. They are something of a pair, as I now realize, except the Zalman story has a fairly happy ending. At least it's an open ending in which Jewishness is presented in a kind of ever open condition as something that embraces universality and strangeness and yet continues to thrive. In Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, the protagonist, who is also a Russian Jew, comes to a more skeptical realization. This skepticism makes him happy, but I don't think it makes the reader happy, because the reaffirmation of his Jewishness comes as a result of his having to pay the price of parting with the woman he loves, who is Catholic, and who wouldn't give up her Catholicism as he wouldn't give up his Jewishness. Now, so that leitmotif is what? It's the way a Jewish man who's an immigrant is terrified of bargaining for the identity of his unborn children. That's something I think is a very real historical condition. It's also a motif that I've enjoyed embroidering upon through fiction. But there are stories in the collection, specifically Horse Country, which do not appear overtly Jewish. I think you just need to dig a little deeper. Sometimes I simply let the reader discover that which I'm hesitant to throw in his or her face. In Horse Country, if you just do a little bit of extrapolating or just look closely at some of the things the characters say to each other, you realize that both of them come from Jewish Russian immigrant families from a big city, probably New York or Philadelphia, although I don't say it deliberately. And they get away from their routine and they visit a slightly surreal, fantastical setting, a horse breeding farm, a stud farm, where they go to ride horses. They escape because I think they have a hard time connecting as they are, and they think that this pastoral setting, this rural, perfect setting will give them a chance to be alone. Quite the opposite happens expectedly. In that sense, I still think that the leitmotif that we identify continues to manifest itself. It's about a certain insecurity of losing one's identity. Why are Jews from the former Soviet Union who came here young enough to have acculturated as Americans and old enough not to have lost their Russianness and Sovietness, and more or less of the right age to know who they are as Jews. Why are these people somehow apprehensive about making the wrong decision as they choose their mates, as they marry, as they become couples, as they form love relationships of different sorts? I think it's so because their identities are already overloaded, right? Compared even to their American Jewish contemporaries and peers. They're not just Jews and Americans, they're also Russians and Soviets. You would observe the same in other conditions. For instance, in interwar France, Russian Jews intensely acculturated after the French fashion. And very often this meant losing Jewishness. And if it meant not losing Jewishness, then it would mean losing Russianness. And this interests me very much because, in a way, I believe there is a kind of finite, shape, form of identity, and then it starts breaking at its seams. And this is really what my characters encounter. You can only take in so much before your identity breaks. So in a way, you fill yourself with Americanness, or you lacquer your veneer with Americanness. You look so American, but beneath it is a raw Russianness or unfulfilled Jewishness. The question is sort of one's literary calling versus one's métier versus one's daily profession of how you put bread on your children's table. And it's not an obvious question, and it's not an easy one. Chekhov used to say, tongue-in-cheekly, right? Believe me, I wish I could write a page or even a sentence like Chekhov did, so I'm not drawing any parallels. The parallel is simply with the idea that he used to say that medicine is his wife and literature is his mistress. I think what that means to me is that you cannot be married to two professions. One has to be the mistress. That is to say, I don't think, unless you are a polygamist, and perhaps some people are successful as professional polygamists, but to me it's always a negotiation, and I think something gives. And in that sense, as a young person in college, first in Moscow and then here, I wrote a lot of poetry, and that was really, in some ways, the essence of my daily existence. That gave way to research, literary criticism, and there was a period in my life, particularly in graduate school, I would live in the library. I was so happy just to be able to have funding to do research about my favorite writers and literary and cultural subjects, and in that sense, my academic output, I think, and my academic daily sort of existence was predominant. That gave way to, I think, writing books of literary criticism that eventually took me in the direction of books that are not just criticism, but also criticism and biography, like my book, Russian Poet, Soviet Jew, about Eduard Bagridsky, which is really about the lives of the generation of young Jews who came of age during the revolution, who had a romance with Russian Soviet culture and the revolution, but realized fundamentally by the early 1930s that assimilation was really a trap. I think increasingly became interested in writing not just about my subjects, but about myself through my scholarship and criticism. I spent 7 years working on the anthology of Jewish Russian literature. I really worked on it every day and had to do other things by snatches, including writing fiction and nonfiction. I think I remember this well because my wife Karen was expecting our first daughter Mira, so it was about 5 years ago that I told myself that I had to carve out time to finish my literary projects in prose. So I wrote Waiting for America quickly, and then I continued to work intensively on fiction. While also continuing to do a lot of scholarship and I am engaged in several research projects and academic projects, a book on Soviet poets as witnesses to the Holocaust, right during the Holocaust and in the immediate aftermath, for instance, is one I'm working on right now. But I have been working, and I'm revising the first draft of a book that is a kind of prequel to Waiting for America. It's a memoir of growing up in the Soviet Union, particularly with a focus on the Refusnik years and the years that coincided for me with the years during which the Soviet system came to its collapse. And it's a long book. It's less of a literary memoir than is Waiting for America, and more of a documentary memoir, but that's what I'm revising as we speak. And then I have a few other things in various stages of preparation. So I think the challenge will remain to negotiate between the mistresses and the wives of my professional existence. I think it's always a challenge for someone who has two professions, be it a doctor and a writer or an engineer and a writer. Victor Shklovsky, one of the creative theorists, one of the most creative thinkers about culture, whom I admire greatly as a scholar and a creative writer, spoke about how one of the greatest mistakes of his career was that he could never choose and focus on one thing. He was always doing screenwriting on the side to support his family, a lot of journalism, and some even hack work as a biographer. I hope it doesn't come to that. But look, the reality of our existence is we do what we can to survive, and I think writers do the same.